Hollow Knight, Ultrakill, Lunacid. What do these games have in common? Well, they're all incredibly popular and beloved indie games that have seen massive success due to their unique and uncompromising visions, by each offering something that you can't quite get anywhere else. There's a laundry list of outstanding indie games that fit this bill that you could add to that list, of course, but today I want to bring one particular game to your attention. I believe it has some of the best aspects of each of the games that I mentioned: the fast-paced and skillful FPS combat of Ultrakill, the rewarding exploration and build crafting of Hollow Knight, and the whimsical and completely singular world design of something like Lunacid. And yet, not nearly enough people are talking about this game. So today, I want to just quickly make you aware of what is my personal favorite new FPS game of the year so far. A game that you can play front to back right now with a shocking amount of content. No early access or any of that, and one which is honestly emblematic of a direction that I'd like to see lots more retro-style FPS games go in the future. And that game is Frogmonster, and it looks like this. Now look, if this voxel-based goofiness isn't immediately your cup of tea, I get it. But looks can be deceiving. Underneath this veneer is a shockingly dense Metroidvania world with tons to explore and discover, fast-paced and skillful FPS combat with enemies that seriously challenge your movement and weapon synergies, and some of the best, toughest, and most unique bosses that the FPS genre has to offer. Oh, and on top of all of that, the atmosphere is seriously fantastic, even despite the unorthodox choice of art style. Are you paying attention now? Good, because I can't wait to unpack this game for you. And for the record, I'll mostly be showing stuff from the first half of the game and trying to avoid significant visual and story spoilers for the endgame. All right? Cool. Metroidvania is a bit of a sticky term. It's a direct comparison to two pretty specific games, and the farther you stray from the original perspective that this genre was founded on, the more nebulous the things that make a game a Metroidvania become. At the point we're at, it's almost sort of just a vibe when it comes to world design and progression. This isn't to incite a genre war, but rather to set the stage for what exactly Frogmonster is. It bills itself as an FPS Metroidvania, but that almost short sells what all it's doing. Its world is open-ish. You start on a pretty linear path, but you'll see hints of obstacles that you can't so easily overcome, and you'll unlock abilities that sort of act as keys, or sometimes just literal keys, unlocking new paths for you to explore until you've opened up a massive interwoven web of areas, no pun intended. Now, this is the creamy middle of the Metroidvania experience, but in Frogmonster, this is all surrounded by a shell of shockingly tight FPS gameplay. And everything you love about the FPS loop has pretty wonderfully been integrated into this framework. After playing so many games with acts and episodes and these closed-in levels, it was so refreshing to travel through this open world and still be delivered things like challenging lock-in arenas a la Doom Eternal, puzzles and platforming, and of course, tons and tons of awesome and difficult bosses that really demand mastery of your movement, abilities, and weapon roster, and honestly earn their self-described Souls-like status. And all of these things are dished out to you at a pace that feels like it belongs to a more level-oriented, episodic, and linear structured game. It's honestly mind-blowing. And just saying it's a Metroidvania FPS doesn't really do the success of this hybrid as much justice as it maybe deserves. But that's Frogmonster from a high-up, bird's-eye view. I want to unpack a little more thoroughly what this game is doing, including a bit of constructive criticism, but mostly glowing praise for what it's got going on. When I look at modern FPS games, there's a few dilemmas in the gameplay loop that I like to see a game address early and often. And those are, how does the game handle healing? How does the game handle ammo management and replenishing? And how does the game allow unique expressions of skill? Frogmonster honestly could have still been a great game by just being a goofy, quirky, silly little game about a frog with a gun, but it actually comes right out the gate with compelling answers for pretty much all of these core FPS questions. You start out the game with a pistol and are quickly introduced to a few creatures to fight. The basic gist of combat boils down to avoidance through movement. You can jump and dash, notably without iframes, both of which are important in combat, and then, well, deal damage back. The first few encounters will pretty quickly introduce you to weak points, normally indicated by glowing eyes which you can shoot for increased damage. And with all the abilities, spells, charms, and weapons that get doled out to you throughout your exploration of this Metroidvania world, the same remains true. Combat is always about using your movement to respond to your enemies and maximizing your damage output by using your weapons effectively and hitting weak points. Unlike in a game like Ultra Kill, where full heals just by getting in close proximity of enemies and dealing damage are plentiful, or Dark Souls, where you can fully heal yourself a somewhat limited number of times in combat, in Frogmonster, healing is integrated into the game's spell system. Essentially, you can equip 3 spells at a time, each of which costs a little bit of mana and deals damage or has some sort of other unique effect. Spells will also heal a fixed amount, varying from spell to spell. The base spell that you start with throws a green orb that is cheap in mana cost, deals a bit of damage, and heals back a full chunk of your health bar. It's a far cry from a full heal, but it's just enough to keep you in those challenging arenas or long boss fights and keep the flow of these consistently satisfying and fast-paced, while hammering home the importance that these spells will have in combat. You also replenish a little mana on a kill. Enemies also drop ammo when you kill them, and you'll generally find your mags running dry and being replenished just enough to keep your weapon variety fresh, but never so much that you'll find yourself completely running out of options. And you'll want to familiarize yourself with your whole arsenal anyways, since while I wouldn't necessarily put the weapon interactivity on the same level as something like Doom Eternal, little unique enemy actions definitely incentivize a good variety of weapon usage. Even down to things like enemies with wooden shields that can be burned. Hell, even just the little procedural stagger that enemies do when you hit them with a high damage attack is seriously satisfying and can sometimes knock their attacks off kilter or bump them back just enough to keep you safe for the time being. All this to say, this isn't just some cute little FPS game. It's actually a seriously well-considered one made by someone who clearly knew what they were doing within this genre. Nowhere is the culmination of all this stuff better exemplified than in boss fights. And clearly the game was aware of this, since there's damn near 30 of them in the game, and the dev just keeps adding new ones. And while I had my nitpicks with a few of them, they're mostly really fun and somehow all feel pretty distinct from one another. I worried a bit at first that things like running out of ammo or mana might significantly degrade the quality of the boss fights down the stretch as they got tougher and longer, or that the game would just run out of ideas of unique ways to challenge the player. And while a couple boss fights had key similarities, to my surprise, they never really got old or too samey. They always felt fresh, they always introduced something new and unexpected, and most importantly, I never felt like I completely ran out of options in combat, got backed into a corner with no ammo or mana, or just any recourse to get back into a tough fight. And that was mostly due to the fact that the developer had foreseen this potential issue where a boss fight just depletes you of all your resources and you lose by default, and tackled it head on. Early on in the game, ammo and resource management is a bigger focus, but bosses are also short enough that you can overcome it just by playing smartly. But as the game wears on, bosses tended to have conditions where you can get them to drop ammo or mana by attacking their weak points, killing their adds, or what have you. The result is that you get some really interesting and challenging endurance fights down the stretch as well that require you to develop a strategy, specific builds with your bugs, which are essentially your charms in this game, and I'll get to those in a moment, and really learn and understand the moves being thrown at you, which is not something you can too often say of FPS bosses. But Frogmonster understood the assignment here beautifully. The variety here is really excellent as well. You'd think with nearly 30 bosses in the game that there would be some familiar territory tread, and there is, but not to an extent that ever felt egregious, and usually when a boss calls back to another boss, it does so deliberately in a way that actually makes sense and enhances the fight in one way or another. Bosses nearly always come down to strategy, damage output, and movement. There are a fair few more gimmicky fights, but never in a way that it feels like the gimmick is undermining the core gameplay. In fact, I won't spoil it here because it's best experience for yourself. I'd go as far as to say that this game has one of the most interesting and creative gimmick fights that I've ever seen, that subverts expectations at every turn while still managing to provide an interesting test of your skills. It's just really cool, and you'll have to take my word for it because I don't want to spoil it. Many, if not most bosses, though, employ what I'll call soft gimmicks. Just a gentle little twist of mechanics here and there. And just to offer some examples, there's a snake boss that follows you around and coils around the arena, effectively restricting your maneuverable space, but you're in control of where the snake goes because it just follows you, which actually creates a pretty interesting movement puzzle as you focus on dealing damage, kiting the snake, and avoiding its body as the arena kind of closes in on you. Another boss is this butterfly, which in order to damage, you have to deal damage to its wings. Effectively, you must fully paint the wing to send it to the next phase, which of course plays into your weapon selection and target prioritization really interestingly. Almost every boss just had neat little wrinkles to them like this that make them each uniquely interesting and fun, but without ever really compromising on the core tenets of observable and learnable movesets that test your knowledge of weapons, movement, strategy, and build crafting. It's really a wonderful mix that speaks to the best elements of both Metroidvanias and Souls, as well as FPS games. Playing creatively into boss fights as well is this game's charm system, which are hilariously and fittingly bugs that you find throughout the world and you slurp them up like, of course, a frog would. They give you short temporary buffs, heal or restore ammo when picked up, but more importantly, once you've caught them, they can be equipped later on for passive buffs, some of which are pretty significant, including ways to generate health, ammo, mana, increase your damage, and so on. Other Metroidvanias I've played have charms that feel more like a build, where you equip ones you like and then stick with them indefinitely to aid your specific playstyle. Others have such specific effects that it feels like you will always be swapping and equipping new ones to suit your situation. Frogmonster feels like it strikes a really enjoyable balance between the two, where you will switch them out based on the boss fight you're on or area you're in, but it's more thoughtful in that everything comes with some trade-offs and different players will undoubtedly favor different things in different situations. Likewise, the weapon upgrade system was, to my surprise, not just damage and stat increases. Most upgrades fundamentally changed the way your weapons worked in a way that felt interesting and meaningful, and had significant trade-offs as well, which opened them up to being tailored to your playstyle or the situation that you're facing. This was really refreshing to see, since it feels far too common that games of this sort just rely on stat increases to power you up so that you're ready for upcoming bosses and challenges. There are still, of course, permanent health and mana upgrades, but that's pretty much it. And I actually like that in Frogmonster, you start roughly as powerful as you will ever be. And while the game still controls where you can and can't go at a given time to some degree, it's kind of a nice feeling to know that really the only thing separating you from immediately being able to take on the toughest bosses and challenges that the game has to offer is just some weapon pickups, maybe some bugs, and a whole lot of learning and improving. Which again is something that I love out of FPS games, as many of you will already know. And I think it speaks incredibly well as to how this marriage of genres has been handled here. Lastly, while I can't state enough how great I think this game is, I do want to talk about some of my criticisms, because they're not completely absent. And while they don't even remotely overshadow the things that I think are great about this game, they might still be a deal breaker for some people. For one, the world design and visuals are absolutely phenomenal if you can get over the jagged voxelness of it all. I think while screenshots and quick clips might not fully do it justice, I find that stuff kind of melts away when you actually play the game. It is quite immersive in that way. It doesn't change though that this is still kind of an obtuse exterior. I think it's great that this game doesn't look like every other retro FPS game out there with crunchy pixelated textures and billboard sprites or low poly models. But I can't help but feel like some people are probably passing on this one, not knowing that it's actually something they might really like. If you take a chance on it, I think you'll find that all of that will melt away and eventually it will charm you just like it did for me. But what might never win you over is the music. Listen, I want to like it. Occasionally I enter a new area and nod my head along to whatever new little jingle starts playing. But every track in the game kind of feels like it was just a little too short, with some of them looping just after a few measures and getting old very quickly. And while everything did have both ambient and combat loops that were a little bit more upbeat, I felt like the epic boss fights were kind of let down by lackluster music that just felt kind of the same as anywhere else, and didn't really give the fights the epic stature that they deserved. I think the overall vibe was right with the offbeat, quirky, and almost even Animal Crossing-like jingles, giving the world a charming, if sometimes slightly eerie vibe. But they just needed a little extra juice or something. They maybe just weren't taken far enough in the direction they were heading. While the world has so much to explore, weird creatures and bugs to find, and so on, I found the central narrative to be overall kind of forgettable. Now, I want to be clear as to separate this from just everything else though, because like many other Metroidvanias, there are still plenty of interesting NPCs to meet and chat with, bespoke storytelling throughout the world, and much more that I think is very well done. But the central narrative that kind of guides you through the world, featuring 3 key characters, just never really grabbed me. I found the core characters and villain to be pretty lackluster. Their motives seemed random and kind of inscrutable, and it sort of just felt like the story was happening to you rather than you really being involved in it, which is an odd choice for a game that gives you so much agency in how you approach things. Your mileage may vary. Maybe you'll find that you really connect with it, but I just didn't. Again, it doesn't completely ruin what is otherwise a very solid full package here. There's a lot to like about the whole presentation of the world and its inhabitants, but the main conflict was just kinda there. And while I think the quality of boss fights here is unequivocally a huge triumph, I think the freedom of approach the game offers you has the potential to lead to some self-inflicted frustration at times, or at least it sure did for me. The game is not devoid of any responsibility here. Like I said, the boss design is really good across the board, but I think how open the game is had me questioning often. Am I supposed to be here right now? Am I missing something that might help in this fight? Sometimes the answer was just swapping my bugs and spells around to get the right build, but other times I could just be missing something and not know. Hell, I missed a whole pretty powerful weapon for most of the game because the entrance to the boss arena where you get it was just this tiny little hole that I swam right past. It's important to mention that the game sometimes gives important specific hints for bosses and encounters on the death screen, so you should try and read these when they pop up. The way this game works though, overall, oftentimes the answer is just get good. I mean, I'm sure if the game itself could talk, it would say it in a much gentler way, but the game is tough. There's no two ways around it. And as you get better weapons and charms, so too do the game's bosses and enemies get even more challenging. This will be some people's cup of tea, without a doubt, but others might feel misled by the game's cutesy exterior, that what they're getting has an equivalent level of difficulty to a Soulslike. For me, even overall difficulty aside, some of these later game fights had a tendency to just overstay their welcome by a little bit. Perhaps I just wasn't doing enough damage fast enough in some scenarios, but the health bar started to feel absolutely massive at a certain point. In fact, there's a boss later on that you can essentially only deal a fixed maximum amount of damage to every cycle, and I really enjoyed the fight for the first, 3 times around, but by the 4th or 5th cycle, it started to feel like it was just going on a bit too long. And this happens a few other times, especially throughout the end game. In general though, the game hit an enjoyable balance most of the time, but as with any difficult game, the fun challenge occasionally dipped into frustration. Hitboxes are just a little bit less than perfect. They're usually good enough and pretty well communicated, but animations sometimes just didn't quite sync up visually with where you actually get hit due to the procedurally animated voxel nature of them, and it took some trial and error to figure out sometimes. I won't spoil the boss visually or narratively because it's a pretty important late game boss, but there was one boss that really had me stumped for a bit. I was able to figure out its moves, which were pretty fun and intuitive, but the whole fight took place on this tiny platform that you could fall off of, which I found needlessly frustrating. The fight was clearly meant to be the biggest challenge of movement and positioning up to that point, and it absolutely accomplished that and then some. But the narrow arena that you can fall off of, combined with attacks that required extremely precise movement and positioning to dodge, made it feel more frustrating than it maybe could have been. And it felt like sometimes things out of my control just lined up to kill me in what felt like sometimes unfair ways. It's tough to say it's objectively a bad thing though, because it was without a doubt one of the most memorable triumphs in my time with this game when I finally learned it and got past it. But it's all to say that not absolutely every decision when it comes to balance and difficulty is going to land perfectly for everyone. It is just really unapologetically Souls-like in that way. At the end of the day though, I admire this game's commitment to being difficult and challenging and mostly accomplishing this in a way that feels fair and completely in line with what many hardcore FPS players are likely going to enjoy in a game like this most of the time. Despite a few shortcomings and perhaps a slightly mismatched art style that might be eluding some FPS fans that might otherwise really enjoy this game, I can't help but just give this game a massive, glowing recommendation for fans of this channel. It has all the makings of what feels like a sleeper indie darling, as well as just a breath of extremely fresh air in the modern FPS space. It's also surprisingly long with a ton of content. I rolled credits on the game in 14 hours, and I'd say honestly that my time was probably on the low end. There was definitely a few things I could have explored more thoroughly, without a doubt, but there's a point in the game where it will feel like it's ending only to reveal that there's still a full third of the game left. It is seriously huge and dense for what it is. I'll be going more in depth on my time with Frogmonster in a later video, but for now, I just wanted to make people aware of it. So, give it a look. Thanks for watching.
Hit that like
This is
button.
alright.
Smash that bell. Hit that
Hit
bell
this-
button. Hit this.
Destroy my
bell
pussy.
button.
Subscribe to Dumper Man.